My name is Noam Pianco. I'm the director of the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies and a professor in the Jackson School of International Studies. And I am really thrilled to welcome you all here to our annual Stroum Lecture series. Tonight is the second of our two public talks. There was also a workshop yesterday. And we're just so thrilled and honored to have Dr. Rafael Neis from the University of Michigan's Department of History and Frankel Center for Jewish Studies as our Stroum Lecture this year. Dr. Neis holds the Jean and Samuel Frankel Chair in Rabbinic Literature and is the Faculty Director of Arts Learning at University of Michigan's New Arts Initiative. And for those of you who were here on Tuesday, you know that you're in for a very engaging and stimulating and interesting lecture. We're lucky to have you here, Dr. Neis, so thank you. Before we begin the rest of the evening, I just wanted to acknowledge that the Coast Salish people of this land, the land where the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land that touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands in the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. This event, like all of our events in the Stroum Center, is made possible by the generous support of community members, and many of you are in the audience. I just want to thank you for your generosity. We also have several graduate students and undergraduates who also really are able to do a lot of things they can do because of community supporters. So thank you for that. I know our students appreciate it as well. And we are also very lucky to have a wonderful staff on the way in. You probably met both Aaliyah Vinacore and Gina Wardell, who, thank you, Gina and Aaliyah. Okay, we're going to let them know that we thank them. Okay, yay. Okay, who are in charge of all the logistics for our events. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Deborah Kamen, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Kamen is professor of classics at UW, is broadly interested in ancient cultural and social history with a particular focus on slavery. And her second book is called Insults in Classical Athens and examines the range of insults in Athens from benign mockery to serious affronts. And most recently, she co-edited a volume entitled Slavery and Sexuality in Classical Antiquity. For many years, Dr. Kamen also served as co-chair of the Lambda Classical Caucus, a coalition of LGBTQ classicists and their allies affiliated with the Society for Classical Studies. So thank you for taking it from here.
Thank you, Noam. I'm delighted to introduce Rafe Neis this evening. I've been aware of their work for some time, but we met for the first time in person just last week when I happened to be at a conference at the University of Michigan. And although we're in technically different fields, I'm in classics and they're in Jewish studies, our areas of interest overlap in various ways. And as you probably guessed from the range of Rafe's professional titles that Noam just recited, Professor Neis's work is truly interdisciplinary. So in addition to the titles that Noam mentioned, Professor Neis also holds multiple affiliate positions in other departments at the U of M, including gender and women's studies, and they are core faculty in the interdepartmental program in ancient history, where they teach and mentor graduate students studying the ancient world from a variety of disciplinary perspectives, including students of classics. And by complete chance, I happened to meet one of these students last week who, again, coincidentally, was raving about Professor Neis's graduate seminar on making knowledge in antiquity. And the student was telling me about how much it's influenced their own work in classics. So Professor Neis is both a scholar and an artist, and these two parts of their identity are, as far as I can tell, deeply interconnected. Their second book, When a Human Gives Birth to a Raven, Rabbis and the Reproduction of Species, was published in 2023 by the University of California Press. And in addition to the gorgeous cover, which they designed, the book contains a number of their comics, paintings, drawings, and mixed media work. Their artwork has also been featured in a number of shows and in many publications, including, I have to make a plug for this, the cover of a recent book by a classicist, Clara, on Greek ethnography. So please join me in welcoming Professor Neis for their talk entitled Monsters, Hybrids, and Holy Images, Rethinking Bodies in Ancient Jewish Art.
Firstly, thank you. Am I audible? Okay, cool. Thanks so much for that really kind introduction, Professor Kamen, and thank you, Professor Bianco Noam for your introduction, for hosting. Thank you to Sasha Senderovich and to Gila Kletenik, who I understand were involved in nominating me. And really warm thanks to Gina Wardell and Alia Vinikor for your just incredible generosity and kindness in sort of both logistics and hospitality. I'm really grateful. Okay, so here's my title, and I'm going to do something for those of you who were with us on Tuesday. I'm going to do something similar, which is I'm going to start off with a title, and then I'm going to disavow it and give you a new title. Okay, I think this is just going to be a signature move from now on. All right, monsters, hybrids, and holy images. So we're going to talk a little bit about how scholars represent images. How do we look at visual culture? How do we understand paintings, mosaics, seals, reliefs, not the animals, sadly, seals, like little seals that you carry with you. That would be so cool if it wasn't the animal. Reliefs and mosaics. And then how do we go on to talk about them, analyze them, interpret them? How do we there represent them, right? When we do that, we are representing those images. Traditional art historical methods, like those of the related field of archaeology, emerged in the 18th and 19th century in Germany and developed methods modeled on contemporary scientific fields, especially of biology. So description became a basic tool of art historical knowledge production, necessitating a formally ideal and universalizable, traveling, technical language to represent images and artifacts, right? You have to make things legible, you need to compare things, so you develop this specialized language. Now, description, of course, is never neutral. We still see echoes of the so-called founding figure of art history, Winkelmann, with aesthetic evaluative approaches that prioritize a certain kind of ideal, which is realism, as the peak of artistic production. And for Winkelmann, that was the art, Greek art, but a very particular selection of Greek art that was seen as this ideal. We also have methods of formal analysis related to description. This is the notion of types, a way of grouping together images and artifacts on the basis of elements that are selected as similar. Sound like assigning other things to you? Yes, it should. That's an allusion to Tuesday's lecture. So there's like an in-group of 3 people who are laughing. And it's not even funny, and they're still laughing. So this is a morphological approach, right? You look at the form of things, or that is, form is not neutral. You select and you prioritize certain elements as the form of something, and you group them together. And this approach is indebted in part to what were then contemporary zoological and anthropological classificatory models. These fused Linnaean taxonomies, right? Linnaeus is called the second Adam because he came up with a taxonomical binomial system that we still use today. And it fused that system with Darwinian ideas of evolution, and those things traveled into art history. We have types, which are formal, often racialized. So, for example, people would, and still do to some degree, talk about, they may not use the word Oriental anymore, thankfully, but they will say something like Eastern Roman flatness or hieratic, schematic. They will talk about Roman, but not Eastern Roman, verism or realism or hyperrealism, right? It's another kind of classificatory model. It has a kind of genealogical idea. So there's an idea that something gives birth to something, and that's something changes a little bit, but is antecedent to another type, and there is it often ends up also coalescing around what I'm going to use a bit anachronistically, nation, ideas of nation. So Greek and Rome are in a way, and that is, of course, is very much a product of the 18th and 19th century, where art historians are, by the 19th century, also understanding style and, type and forms. Eventually, it coalesces into something called style. So there's the Greek style, the Roman style. In order to posit a national style, you have to do another kind of astonishingly bold selection process and need to make a lot of decisions. That is, you need to decide how to cluster objects and images that fit, and you need to decide to call that, the things that fit, a unified style. You need to posit a certain kind of chronological and geographical unity. And this already started with Winkelmann, right? This idea that you can periodize, that is, you can attribute certain style to a certain time and a certain place. And so art history becomes deeply rooted in the understanding of style as a reflection of national sensibilities or zeitgeist. And this meant searching for this unity within a region. Often it's racialized, and less these days, or it's neutralized a little bit, the racialization. For a while, words like ethnicity were used, and now the word race is coming back, but in a critical way. And it highlights unity over diversity. And so it's, again, this issue that we alluded to on Tuesday, which is often classificatory models need to deal with exceptions, especially if they're unitary or binary. So you need to sort of decide that the outliers are somehow anomalies, deviations, and that even if they add up, they don't add up enough to threaten the paradigm that you've created. Okay, so that's, I'm giving you a very particular critical introduction to art historical methods. And there's another way, and this is very reductive, of course, but I think it's not false. Another kind of tool of analysis is iconographic analysis, which looks at elements of an image or perhaps a large mosaic or even a building, right, or a sculpture. And it's sort of that next level of interpretation. And sometimes the way, iconographic interpretation will work is that it will take elements and it will not always attribute a one-to-one literal interpretation. So for example, and we'll see this later, vines become the tree of life. And it can be, it's a Christian symbol, right? A goblet can become a chalice, which can become, again, a Eucharistic symbol. So it involves understanding images as containing signs that point sometimes to something else, almost like a code. Okay. And I'm just going to show you just some, the thing that you're really not supposed to do as an art historian is to show images, because images don't talk, they don't speak for themselves. Unless, of course, you attribute agency to images, which is another approach to history of art. And in that case, the images are doing things to you, whether or not they're speaking. What I'm showing you here, though, are just the way that principles that come from archaeology, which are essentially morphological principles of clustering forms. This reminds me of various forms of, early eugenics, racial science, right? It reminds me, the truth is taxonomies do derive from this decision to prioritize certain kinds of, select for similarity and create clusters of that, to create clusters of likeness, right? But these, even the use of types within archaeological studies are being heavily critiqued as human constructs, not as realities that exist, right? And the problem with the type is that you decide this is the style or the type that reflects 2nd century lamps, and you use that then to date everything to the second. It's very cyclical. So you create the type, you attribute a date to it, and then you use that to attribute a date. So it can be a little bit like similes all the way down. And here's another example of that kind of morphological gaze. So besides these approaches, I would say that there are, the sort of newer art history, again, being a bit reductive, would perhaps pay more attention to social, economic, and political contexts, including contexts of gender and race. Might think about the viewer-user experience, and sort of less that moves away from iconography sometimes and intent of the artist, and more to how people might have interacted with the image or artifact, the spaces, the liturgical or religious context, the social. It dovetails very well, of course, with number one, right? And it opens up multi-sensory ways of experiencing art, right? We don't just see art. we have co-presence with art, right? It pulls on more of our senses than just our eyes. And the other thing that it does is it opens up polyvalence, multiple meanings. Because the minute we realize that multiple people gaze or interact with a thing, we realize that meaning or interpretation cannot be unitary. So in that sense, it's a little different to iconographic analysis, which often wants to impose a program of meaning on a particular object. You know, they'll sort of walk you through every element of a very complex mosaic, and it sort of becomes about three themes: salvation, right, the eschaton, and cheese. I thought I'd throw in that last one, because wouldn't it be cool if that would be the program? And then, of course, there's the more explicit, and this is really, you know, it's not new. It's been at least since the 80s and 90s, at least in sort of Euro-America, a decolonial approach that recognizes how art history was built on a march of progress, a teleology that went from Greece to Europe and America in the present, and that seeks to account for that, and that tries to maybe open up the canon or tries to critique those formal tools that I just mentioned, which are so much byproducts of that formation of the field, and are not necessarily suitable for expanding the canon, because they take ideas of aesthetics and value that are founded actually supposedly in the Greek and Roman aesthetic traditions. Whether they are or not is another matter. And so there are ideas about expanding the canon, burning the canon, thinking of art history as a global enterprise, or complex ideas of the global and the local, sometimes known as the glocal, which sounds like a hipster beer that is a little bit gassy but very local. And of course, thinking about acquisition. That is the idea of enshrining certain objects as art with a capital A, putting them in special places that we like to call galleries or museums. There's a lot to unpack there, from how was that selection made, how are objects being displayed, who feels comfortable in those spaces, to how did they get there? And that gets super, super messy with, certain artifacts being occasionally repatriated to their original sites, because, the sort of TLDR of the whole thing is European colonialism, but also American colonialism. Yay. Okay, so having said this, this was the title that we started with, and I'm going to suggest that the word monster is a very loaded and overdetermined word, because it sort of already abjects, that is, rejects and puts something outside as deviant. The word hybrid, as we understand it, is a word that comes from zoology and scientific racism, and it comes from a particular idea of what a species was. A species, as we understand it, from taxonomy, is a relatively new concept, and the word hybrid carries with it other terms like mixture, miscegenation. It directly comes from the same kind of scientific thinking about race and botany and non-human species. And so it's a very overdetermined word. The word holy, right, also makes a decision ahead of time, and especially in a context of Jewishness, perhaps conjures that extremely boring specter of idolatry, which I find couldn't be less interesting, because, again, it's so overdetermined, this idea of a prohibition, the second commandment. It's too much hype around that. So I'm going to suggest that we completely abandon this title. Whoop. It's going on. I'm swiping left. Did you notice? And we're swiping right on this. Ancient Jewish, ? Visual culture, and just surprise, after trans studies. Just, So that was the title I came up with today. I've had so many titles that I've changed this to, but that's today's title. And I'm not sure that I'm going to particularly mention trans studies explicitly, but hopefully those of you who've heard Tuesday's talk and who were in the workshop will see what I mean by it. And if you don't worry, feel free to ask. All right, so we're going to have 2 case studies. I'm putting the third one that I'm not doing in brackets. So just because, can't really let go. So the first is going to be, so it's there in a kind of weird vestigial, haunting way. Biotraffic. So we're first going to look at Helios in the Galilee, and then we're going to look at Lilith in Mesopotamia. All right? Bonk. Okay, Helios in the Galilee. Here's Helios in the Galilee. Okay, so we're looking, the camera is sort of slightly raised. We're probably on the second floor. You can sort of see the railings. We're in the Galilee, and this is the synagogue of Chamat Tiberia, or Chamat Tiberias Synagogue, which was built in the second half of the 4th century. We are at the back end of what's called the nave of the synagogue, the central mosaic of the synagogue. So at the south end, that is where the kind of front is. Oh, I should have got one of those cool art history kind of lasers that you mustn't point at people. But imagine I'm doing it. Okay. At the front end, that's furthest from us, was a little step that you can. Oh, what? Wow. Thank you so much, Sarah. Did you just carry this about your person at all times? Oh my gosh. I'm so impressed. Do I press the top one to make it? Oh, cool. That makes so much. Oh, wow. Yeah. Wow. Okay, guys. This is like, I feel like this is so beautiful. And I love that it's going to be memorialized. It's so cool. So that, where I pointed, over there, like, can I multitask? That's the question. Whoa. Speaking of mic and point left? I don't know. But with my right hand, so many things are happening here. So there's a raised niche that you can see, and that would hold the ark, which is sort of a cabinet or container for the scrolls of the Torah, of scripture. And excavated debris found there contained remains of brightly painted interior walls. And I kind of want to say that really loudly, because it's something that those of you who've seen images like this, often the floors are preserved and the walls are not. Perhaps this would have been the least of what hit your eye. And that's so cool to imagine. And I'm sort of imagining how extra this space would have been. And that perhaps looking on the floor would have been a relief. And I don't mean that in a sculptural sense, because that would have been a safety hazard, right? So in front of the ark, there's like 3 panels. Whoopsie. So there's 3 panels. There's one panel or band here. There's one band here, and then there's another band here. And there's more stuff. We're just going to problematically focus on this. And then we're going to be even more problematically focused just on this person here. But I'll just tell you briefly that what's happening here is there's a depiction again of a Torah ark with 2 menorot candelabra, ritual candelabra, with a lulav, a palm frond, a ritual palm frond, and a citron, an etrog. And there's an incense shovel over there. And there's maybe other stuff that I can't remember, sorry. Over here, there's an inscription and a couple of lions. And here is the area that exercises everybody. And that still scholars are just trying to understand, how could this be? I just want to explain that. That's my father's voice. And if this is ever uploaded on YouTube, hi, Dad. I regularly use your voice to kind of express consternation. Okay, so in the middle is the figure of Helios, a sun god. Around Helios, in these outer bands, these circular bands, are 12 figures representing the zodiac. And in the corners, you have 4 seasons. And so this causes a lot of consternation. What is Helios, a Greek god? I'm downplaying the imitation of my father here anyway. What is Helios, a Greek god, or maybe related to Sol, a Roman god? Who knows? God knows. What are they doing? What are they doing in the synagogue? And I want to just also share with you that this combination of elements, Helios, zodiac, seasons, is relatively rare. So it shows up, I think, in 5 synagogues in Palestine and in 3 other places, in Germany, in Switzerland, and in Greece. One of those 3 has not just Helios, but Selene, like the sort of moon god. So that's kind of interesting already. There's something, that's sort of an argument for something particular about the constellation. I'm using that kind of clustering thing, the clustering of Helios gods and representations of Helios and the zodiac and the seasons in what seem to be, let's call them Jewish spaces. All right, so this is my little kind of, this is what we're going to be focusing on. And I just want to point out, even what I'm doing now, the convention of using slides and focusing on things and then putting things side by side and comparing them, that is, was embedded into the making of art history with the advent of photography, which allowed for the formal morphological detachment of art in the form of flat two-dimensional photographs, and allowed people then to stack things and stagger things and put things in piles, right? And to do this kind of stylistic analysis. So this is, what I'm doing is extremely problematic, right? So who am I to criticize? Well, I'll tell you who I am. Okay, so here we have Helios, right? Just lovely rays of sun radiate, lovely blush on the cheeks, right? Interesting kind of like lipstick there. We see the globe and a whip, which are customary either of Helios or Sol Invictus, Roman sun god. And we can just about make out the, oh man, not paws. Come on, horses have hooves. Oh, in America you say hoofs, which is adorable. But hooves, the horses' hooves, as behoove the horses, right? Okay. And this is a reconstruction. And this is also interesting, right? Because what we don't see is the paint. We don't see any, there were gloriously painted images on the walls. And we see, right here, this is the place of Helios. We also see a second floor, potentially. Sometimes there's even a balcony, which would have, of course, according to some pious contemporary scholars, have been where the women sat. Absolutely no evidence that there was a woman's gallery or women's gallery in ancient synagogues. Everything points to there not being a separation in these places. Okay, so this is the synagogue. We're looking at Israel, Palestine, and here is the Lake Kinneret. And this is Tiberias, and we're going to, and which, by the way, this location is Hamat Tiberias, and it's near Tiberias proper. And in general, this area has a high concentration of, artifacts, inscriptions that we can identify as Jewish, using various criteria like names, words like certain kinds of names, certain words like Jewish. Or Judean, and also literary evidence, that is, from the Talmud and Midrash, identify these place names come up very often. Okay, we're going to now do that problematic art historical thing where we put things side by side, and we're going to look at another synagogue mosaic in Bet Alpha. And what's interesting in this mosaic, and people will note, is that this is one of those 5 Palestinian synagogues, right? You've got Helios, and I apologize that it's not a great, the visibility isn't great, but hopefully it's sufficient for you to see that the style is very different, right? Here you have Helios, you have 2 and 2 horses side by side and some kind of starry night, and this is the rays that are emerging, perhaps a moon over here. You have the zodiac, the 4 seasons. You have the same kind of representation of a Torah ark, 2 candelabra or menorot, 2 lions, and various ritual artifacts. But instead, or as well as an inscription, here's an inscription, here you have a depiction of the sacrifice the almost sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, and that's God's hand. Stop, right? There's God's hand. Oopsie. There's God's hand, and I think let me see if I can do this. The ram is somewhere over here. I can't quite see it because it's sort of opposite for me. Okay, so just taking these 2 elements, again, very problematic. I'm taking them from in isolation, but looking at them and imagining that you had to describe them, right? These are the kinds of words scholars have used to distinguish them. So they will refer to Bet Alpha as folk art, naive, Primitive, not so much anymore. Crude, less these days. But folk art sometimes comes to replace crude and primitive, and it's a way of covering over but saying the same thing. And then the ostensibly neutral schematic and hieratic versus the style in Hamat Tiveria, which is realistic, naturalistic, and it's often words like drapery, right? The quality comes up, shading, dimensionality, perspective, and modeling, which is, of course, a way of representing roundness, for example, on these columns over here, the shadow in the drapery, right? A certain kind of perspective. It's not what a form of perspective that was invented in the Renaissance, which is called single point perspective. It's a different model of perspective, right? But it represents a certain depth to the surface, the plane of the image, and there's absolutely no interest in doing that here. And the reason I'm bringing these two images together is because in a more march of progress or teleological driven account, it is interesting that this is the later image and this is the earlier image, right? You've got 4th century and then 6th century. And scholars that is, used to sort of then have to sort of explain why did the standard, because they saw this as a kind of aesthetic descent. Or sometimes it would be sort of charming. You know, there's a way that the later one is seen as charming, you know, almost adorable. And there was all kinds of explanations have been given, like, you know, they didn't have as much money. Right, they couldn't afford the posh. So there's also a regional argument that these are local artisans versus the other one, which is, you know, they must have hired people who were trained by either in Rome or closer to Rome, or by people who came from Rome or from closer to Rome, right? So there's this whole kind of, I guess, way of thinking about empire and something like race, right? A kind of, that is bound up with this aesthetic valuation, right? Okay. So, and here's just a quick, this is a better image, better quality. You can see a little better the differences between these images. And I'm doing something unforgivable, which is I'm skipping ahead to the two focuses of what we're doing, which is, again, problematic. I'm just focusing on this figure of Helios. And I'm partly doing it because I think that's the figure that has obsessed people the most. That's the biggest problem. The horses, not so much. Okay. And even the zodiac, you know, people, it's about the calendar. It's a metaphor. Nobody really believed in astrology. They sure did. Okay. So now we're going to do, again, really problematic morphological comparison, which I've just critiqued. So we've got Bet Alpha. We've got our friend from Hamat Tiveria. And I'm going to introduce another site, which is, I'm sorry, I'm realizing despite the generosity, I'm going to use words. Do you see that blue dot? Okay, so that's Sepphoris, another area in which there were a lot of Jews. And when I say there were a lot of Jews, there were a lot of other people too. And one of the most difficult problems is, how do you talk about population and something, you know, what is Jewishness? What is Jewishness, right? How do you count? You know, people sort of say majority Jewish cities, but it's not clear how they're making those determinations. And if people are not Jewish, what are they? And that's a kind of, maybe we'll touch on that, but it's one of the biggest problems in doing Jewish history. So the reason I'm showing you this image is that it is, again, it thwarts the teleological argument, because we're moving from a style that would be called perhaps naturalistic or realistic in the 3rd century to what we might say, trying to be as neutral as possible, more abstraction, right, as we move along. And what I love about the way that art historians talk is that they call that image the Mona Lisa of the Galilee. And there's another image in the Middle East that is called that. And there's a very important, and it's a very interesting, and it's a smoking gun, right? Because it's telling you what art historians, especially in Israel, want, which is in service of putting Jewish art in the canon. It couldn't be more transparent, right? And it's of course also in service of a Zionist nation building project that wants to put Israel in the Eurovision Song Contest. In other words, in the art historical, maybe a little less cheesy, more classy because it's art history. We all have to wear lovely scarves. Have you been to art history conferences? I don't have the salary to afford the scarves. Hermes, I think. So this is a way of putting Jewish art history into a European nation-building canon, right? If you want to be a real nation, you have to have your Mona Lisa, and we have ours in antiquity, right? And it's also it's interesting because it goes forward in time. They're not saying this is like the classical idealized Greek form of art, right? So in a way, it's revealing its modernist aspirations by naming it as an early modern piece. Okay. Oh, I'm pressing this to do the slide. See, this is the problem. Too many toys. Yes. Okay. So then, obviously, an older way of doing art history would have perhaps, wanted to make this chronological, but that doesn't quite work, right? But it would sort of want to put these on a poll. And the question is, and I'm very much reminded of scholarship or scientific thinking, I'm going to use science now in an authoritative way, that wants to use binary or spectrum forms of classification around species or sex gender too, right? And that it might look better when there's a spectrum, but it still is ultimately kind of binary, right? It means that there are two poles. There might be many other ways of representing sameness and difference, just even looking at these images, right? This is not the only way. And unfortunately, I didn't have time to create other visualizations, but that can be, something in the zine part of the evening. So we're just going to step back a little bit before we just do a little bit more of comparison and talk a little bit about style again, and especially the way that it supports this idea of periodization, which I hope in a way I'm trying to sort of argue doesn't quite work. Now, the problem, of course, is that you could take those three images as emblematic of their times, which they're not. At every time, there is a diversity of style. That's one of the problems with the argument. And sometimes people will take this and they will talk about essentially a move from the classical idealism of Greek art to the late Roman / early Christian period where art kind of gets a bit more crappy, right? So it's sort of the decline. And of course that leads to the Dark Ages, right? Now they'll redress it, that people won't quite put it that way. So then there'll be sort of this idea that the reason this happened is actually, it's not because they couldn't do things, they didn't forget. Although maybe they did, or, they couldn't afford it. But then another way of describing it is to say, well, it is expressive of the way that hierarchy and a certain transcendental idea of the world was guiding Christian and even late Roman and Christian representation. So they will try to say that art expresses the political zeitgeist of its day, which is very hard to prove, and in a way very hard, well, maybe easier to disprove, but it's a very hard thing to prove. And so here I'm just sort of want to show you here that the question of region is one way, that is geography is one way to let diversity in. And so if we're looking at Palestine, that comes under provincial art, and that can explain, right, a certain amount of diversity can be allowed or can be, is dwelt upon by art historians in service of thinking about what it means to make art in the provinces. And there's some pushback about that, because again, there's a recognition that maybe there are different kinds of diversity in different regions, but there isn't a binary between there's provincial looking art in Rome itself. It doesn't hold up. Okay, so I'm just moving ahead. Okay, and I just want to say a couple more things that, again, stepping back again, and then we're going to continue looking. In my earlier work, my first book was about the history of vision. And the basic idea about writing about vision, it seems like a very strange thing. What does it mean for vision to have a history, right? Is it just the history, of all the things that people saw. That would be both incredibly fascinating and quite dreary, which I wish I had written that book, very Borgesian. But the insight is, and this is something that is both argued by cognitive psychologists and by anthropologists and historians, and to some degree art historians as well, alike, is that vision changes. The ways that humans see and perceive the world cognitively changes. So if any of you study cognitive science, you know how many competing theories there are about how the brain sends representations of, right, how the eye feeds certain data through to the brain, which then sends representations and sort of reconstructs that information into something called sight. It's an extremely complicated process. We don't look at the world and the world is ordered. Our eye, right, darts back and forth, picking up little bits of information, and in real time, the brain is synthesizing it and often faking it, which is why many studies also show that the brain invents things. It invents fourth legs on tables, for example, and many, many other things. That is, vision is, even in a kind of reductive scientific way, not at all straightforward. Okay, and in a cultural sense, it is also clear that people have different practices of seeing, and they see things differently. And a very kind of painful and good example is racist ways of seeing. The ways that white people cannot differentiate between people of color. That is, the most prosaic and devastating example of a failure, a cognitive failure of living in a predominantly white world, and the sort of the typical error of confusing people, or there's also sexuality-based versions of this, as I can attest, and gendered versions of this, the kind of you all look alike. Oh, really? You're not sisters? Well, sisters who? Anyway, so there's sort of there are many contemporary examples we can think of that show how thinking is socialized in us. And literally on a cognitive level, we are failing to make distinctions and to individualize people. We are taught to see racistly, cis-sexistly, sexistly, and we have to actively retrain our brains. It's not enough to know the things. You actually have to train your eye. Think about people who didn't grow up writing cursively or reading cursively and cannot read cursive script. It's a generational thing. You can do it. You have to train your eye. You haven't trained your eye. So these are habits of vision. The idea of naturalism, the idea that certain kinds of art or that a photograph gives us the world naturally, is a convention. It's simply not true. It cannot be true, because we don't even see naturally. If you map the way the eye sees the world, you would get a headache because the eye moves so much. And even more if you're an artist. They've done studies on how artists look, and the eye moves even more kind of almost haphazardly and randomly as it's trying to pick up information. So the idea of naturalism, and we say, oh, that looks so real, is entirely conventional. Not everybody across all times and spaces will see that thing as natural. And realism, as art historian Norman Bryson has taught us, is a means of persuasion, right? It's a way of saying, this looks realistic to you. You've been convinced that this image looks realistic. And the final point to make is that an image, any kind of image, this is sort of obvious, doesn't record how you see. So an image is a way of organizing the world. Things look natural because your eye says, what a relief, it's so simple. I have somewhere to rest my eye. This looks like a table. Because you're actually released for a minute from the burden of being a human that does not see the world like that. It's exhausting, the amount of data that you're seeing. You're seeing so much more than that table. So what a blessed relief the conceit and the fiction of naturalism is. What I want to show you now, what I want to think about now, is to do some I kind of want to ask some problematic questions. So I want to think about Helios's gender. Helios's sex gender. Now, Helios's gender is never a problem for people. And I want to ask, how come? Right? Everybody assumes Helios is, well, what, a man? No, Helios is a god. But whatever a god is, right? A manly god. And what's interesting is Helios, we're seeing Helios next to the Bet Alpha Helios. We're also seeing Helios next to Helios and Selene that was created as part of a mosaic in a monastery round the corner from the Bet Alpha mosaic, right? So you can also sort of see, if you want to, a scale of naturalism and an abstraction. But the naturalist and the abstract mosaics are at the same time during the reign of Justinian. In fact, there's an inscription in the Bet Alpha mosaic actually mentioning Justinian as one of the contexts of the mosaic's making. So if we look at Helios in the middle mosaic in the monastery, that's the figure with a kind of radiation of the sun. And look at their sibling or lover, Selene, right? It's the idea that one is a man and one is a woman is very interesting in the sense that the iconographic means are not very different, right? Or we could certainly argue that they're not very different. We could use some sort of different selection criteria to say that Helios on the left, right, holding that kind of torchy thing, is so manly, and Selene is so, I was going to say moonly, womanly. But there is certainly, from a formal point of view, in terms of the way the features are constructed, the shape of the face, right? People kind of talk about masc and femme faces, right? Helios's face is more slender, right? Selene's face is rounder, right? It's not clear that you can assign a gender that easily. And I'm showing you here now, and I'm trying to stay mostly in West Asia / the Middle East and not go to Rome. I'm showing you here some, not contemporary, but regional images of figures that are usually gendered as femme. So we have Helios, and then we have Autumn, who is represented as Tighe in Mabada, Jordan. And there are a bunch of these. Because there are 4 seasons, and so each of them is represented as the god of fortune. There is, the reason I decided to select for this comparison is I was looking for the kind of the blushing cheeks, right? The blushing cheeks and the darkened lips, the kind of almond eyes, the sort of prominent eyebrows, a bit of Frida Kahlo happening, right? Something about the, some degree of modeling using shade, which denotes in the repertoire or the convention of realism, it denotes this is dimension. And we say, oh yes, it's so realistic because you put a darker color there. Right? That's how realism works. It's so persuasive. And all the way to the right, we're also in the same neck of the woods. We're in Lebanon. And we're looking also at a figure that is gendered usually as femme. And here too, you have, I would argue that what you also have is sort of that same play of some modeling, some kind of blush of the cheeks, some redness of the lips, and potentially also a different kind of skin coloring, right? Which we can talk about, is that not racialization? That is also a slightly complex question. Here we have, again, these are all figures that are, if this is Suche, the soul, but it's not exactly divine, it's a personification, but these are all femme, sort of not exactly human figures. Most of them are sort of sacred type figures. I'm not sure that I call Spring a sacred type figure, but it's not exactly a human figure. And the reason I'm putting these side by side is, again, that to me, all these figures are, if you're using the kinds of assumptions that many art historians make about gender, they, to me, are a group. That is, Helios, to me, can fit in terms of the mode of representation, beardless, right? A certain kind of slender face fits just as well with these other figures. Now, you might argue that these figures are mask-leaning, right? That they look masculine, right? But again, that's assuming, of course, that gender was seen in the ways that most art historians think gender should be, should be seen, right? It's not clear that that's how gender was seen. And I'm going to give you an example of how that is raced in modern art history soon. The other thing that we notice is that although the Helios in this mosaic has never been called effeminate, which is very surprising to me, other images of Helios have been. And the one on all the way to the right is in a village very near Hamat Tiberia, and would have been standing at the time that Hamat Tiberia was built, and was described, because it's assigned to Romans and not Jews, because we know that. It's not clear why and how we know that. I think that there's a relationship between its assignation as Roman and its perceived effeminacy. Okay, so now, of course, this is Dionysus, you will say, and I'll say, yes, it is. But the other thing you see repeatedly is everybody acknowledging that certain people are, that is, certain figures are represented similarly. Helios, Apollo, Sol, Dionysus, also sometimes Orpheus, and of course Christ sometimes. And sometimes it's said very explicitly androgynously or effeminately, or, there are different ways of saying, or like a boy or boyishly. But there is a deep recognition that sometimes surfaces. But again, it doesn't surface around Helios. And I think that absence of thinking about Helios's gender is very interesting. And here's an example of a mosaic of Sol, supposedly, right, a sun god, in a tomb in the 3rd century in Rome that has caused scholars a lot of, I would say, similar kind of crisis of faith almost that Helios has. Because originally, when it was found, alongside other images of what was decided was Jonah and the whale, and Christ as the good shepherd, that is somebody holding a sheep, it was very clear, although there was no other evidence, there was a missing inscription, it was clear this is Christian, and that therefore this is Christ's soul. And how wonderful, because, not how wonderful, but this is so clearly Christ, but appropriating, and so it's really interesting that they're appropriating potentially image related to the imperial cult or a Roman sun cult. And only recently have scholars said, wait, just a second, there's absolutely nothing to say that this isn't just the image of a god, right? And that looking at all, everybody was using one image to reinforce, this image is Christian, and so the others must be Christian. So there was always a constant of Christian that then reinforced the reading of everything as Christian. And my question is, what's been happening with Helios? And I'll tell you the answer. So mostly scholars have said, there's a couple of camps. One camp is, this is Jewish, the rabbis would have approved of it, it's not idolatrous, it's not really Helios, it's a metaphor, it's a symbol, it's the idea that God is in charge of the calendar and the seasons. So it's been neutralized. It's on the floor, so it's not sacred, right? It's not God, it's an angel, it's Metatron, it's the angel Anaphiel, it's Elijah, it's Joseph, there's another one, it's Joseph. That's one school. Another school is, no, these Jews were pagans. They were idol worshippers. I kind of love that one. Because in a way, it's just like really like, no, it's just as binary, of course, right? It's like the rabbis would never have set forth in that synagogue. These are heathen Jews. And then there's a third one, which is also, and this is, by the way, where we've done like assigning gender. There's, I think, implicit assigning race, because assigning religion is related to assigning race in antiquity. It's a very vexed, intertwined thing. And so the one that I really like says, no, this is actually Yahweh, which is really interesting. Martin Goodman says that. This is just fully the Jewish God. So there's something kind of wonderful about that one. And I see these two debates as entirely parallel. And what's interesting is, again, the gender stuff is spoken about with the Christ images, kind of, but never with the Helios image. And if we had time, we would talk about this fascinating classification of this altar stone, which it has a menorah and actually some sort of probably a Helios symbol. It's a bit damaged, and that people are just convinced is Iturian, which is basically an ethnicity that is mentioned a couple of times. It's not clear if it really exists, and this is part of the problem of attributing a kind of racialized religious ethnicity to people based on objects. And mostly people do not talk about the menorah. And if they do, they call it a tree of life. When is a menorah a tree of life? The final thing I want to point out, and unfortunately we're ending here, is that there are traditions, and this is from a book called Sefer HaRazim, from the 4th to 5th century, found in the Cairo Geniza, of Jewish worship, or at least Helios being part of some kind of Jewish pantheon. And here we have a ritual with a prayer that will allow you to summon holy Helios who rises in the east, good mariner, trustworthy leader of the sun's rays. And you say this prayer, you mention your name, and you present a supplication, and you can find out everything in the future. So Helios presents us with entangled questions related to the formal qualities of style and iconography. Who even is this? I'm calling this Helios. Even the identity of this image is contested. Its sex gender, I want to argue, is not exactly binary. Helios is not cis. And yet, interestingly, that has not been noticed. A surprise, surprise. Not even in a stigmatizing kind of, trans-misogynist way of, effeminacy, which is sometimes, if you want, the trans method is to look for insults. In the present, though, not in ancient Greece, right? For present insults. And that can be a clue to there being data that you need to examine. And then finally, the question of whose is it? Which is, again, a kind of ethno-religious and, in a way, a racialized question. Right, because if you're not Jewish, what are you? And then you get into this kind of language of, there are people called Jews, and that's an ethnicity. But then there are people called Arabians, but that's a race, right? There's this very strange, uneven handling of race and ethnicity as it pertains to antiquity. Next time, in the third lecture that I was not invited to give, you will learn about Lilith. And all I will do is leave you with a teaser. And this is an image I took. It's of Lilith. And yes, that white stuff is mouse's droppings. Although apparently, no, it's a different kind of rodent. I did discuss it with a curator. She told me, Mademoiselle, it's not mouse droppings, it's something else. And yes, it, like many of the objects that we have, right, it reaches us in the afterlife of colonialism. And I have to, of course, also mention that it's this bowl lived in Iraq under the Iranian, when Iraq was under Iranian rule, right, under the Sasanian Persian rule. And the bowl reaches us due to French colonialism and then Ottomans selling the bowl to the French. And the same problems beset many of the artifacts that we looked at, the sort of Israeli Antiquities Authority, some of the, and the Israeli Antiquities Authority and its dealings and the complexities of the violence in Palestine and, of course, in Iran, right? So that inflects our ability to look at objects or restricts our ability to look at objects, making us more reliant on photographs, right, in ways that are make the task of an ethical art history all the more difficult. And the question for this fourth lecture is, how come the gender of Helios in Palestinian Jewish synagogues has gone unremarked, although all those other aspects around race, religion, haven't. But the sex gender of Lilith and other, and Sasanian and Iraqi or Mesopotamian art is a very vexed matter where people either fault Sasanian artists for not knowing how to draw the soft and tender limbs of a lady, and or are absolutely clear, for example, that this Lilith must be a woman because look how gorgeous. You know, in other words, it moves from they didn't know how to do sex gender to I know a woman when I see one, to some very interesting morphological art historical studies that gather the data and that basically end up concluding that breasts and hips do not make a woman in Sasanian art. You cannot gauge things via secondary sex characteristics. So that will be the teaser, and I would be absolutely delighted if you have thoughts, questions, and disagreements.